Greetings, everyone. My name is Nerea Hawk, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I would like to welcome you to 360-degree planning, building comprehensive support for a successful campaign, one of many webinars in our free webinar series. We are broadcasting live from our offices in Seattle, Washington, and Los Angeles, California. We hope you're all having a fantastic day, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to go over just a few logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. Please close any programs other than GoToWebinar that are running on your computer. We recommend calling in with a telephone instead of using your computer speakers, just tend to get better sound quality that way. Move your cell phone away from your computer to avoid any feedback. And if you experience visual issues, please send us a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoToWebinar at the number on your screen there. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes and you'll earn 1 continuing education credit that is good with your participation with CFRE International. Within the next 24 hours, you'll receive an email from GoToWebinar that includes information on how to download your certificate and how to access today's presentation. We do welcome questions throughout the webinar. Please use the questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel that should be on the right side of your computer screen. And we're also doing something a little bit different today, so asking your forgiveness in advance if we have any technical issues, but we really wanted to make this particular webinar very conversational. We have live video, as you can see, with our panelists. We're going to be playing some audio clips from some of our client partners, and we've never done this before, so thank you in advance for your patience and forgiveness if anything goes awry. And I also wanted to mention that a lot of the material that we'll be covering in today's webinar was originally conceived as a Northwest-focused thought leadership initiative. And then once we got through the whole thing, we realized this is really relevant for the entire country. And so this webinar is national. You'll hear a lot about Northwest regional projects, but it's very relevant, I think, for anyone, anywhere. And without any further ado, I will introduce our panelists. So we have first Joanne Mills, senior consultant here, who has 9 years of experience with the firm, spanning 17 years and many long-term campaign projects with our clients. She has been a senior director of development for Seattle Children's Hospital and Group Health Foundation, and a consultant to leadership teams at Microsoft. We also have Dan Neves, a senior consultant on our executive search team. He has 25 years of professional experience in higher education, cultural institutions, and executive search. For 13 years, he has led the search for executive directors and heads of development. He specializes in assessing philanthropy leaders, and over half of his chief development officer searches have required leaders to envision, oversee, or complete campaigns. Very interesting. And then finally, Anna Gorin is a consultant on our communications team in Seattle, where she brings a unique fundraising lens to campaign communications, from preparation all the way through to the public phase. And Anna brings over 8 years as a writer and journalist to her client work, helping organizations tell the stories that deepen relationships and make campaigns possible.
So, the question for today, and I can see that I'm being labeled as Anna Gorin. This is Anna. I'm Joanne. That's Dan. The question for today, what makes a campaign a success? And if you're thinking of a major fundraising campaign, of course, this is your question, because it's not something that you want to fail at or even fall short of once you set a goal. That doesn't feel good as a professional, and it's not going to serve your organization well. So the question really is, how do we set it up so that it can become a success? The final measure of campaign success, and there's always more to a campaign than this, but let's just be honest, it's the money. It's bringing in and nailing that goal or exceeding the goal. Those are the 2 really successful options for any campaign. But money, the problem is that money is a lagging indicator. You don't know until you've got it and you're there. And so setting a campaign up for success really has to begin long before that the presence of that indicator. And what we're really discussing today is that setting a campaign up for success starts long before you actually ask anyone for money. The organization and the organizational leaders really have to tackle other really tough, compelling questions first. One of the things that we did at Campbell & Company is think through, if we had to boil campaign success down, what would it be? And so Aggie Sweeney, who's a senior consultant in our Seattle office, former CEO of Collins Group in the Northwest, which is another consulting firm, and she's the current chair of Giving USA's Foundation, board chair. We asked her to draft and to reduce all of our thinking on campaign success over the past 40 years that Campbell & Company has been helping nonprofits. And Aggie drafted 10 best practices to fuel your fundraising, and we have shared this document with you. You will notice, I think, that not all of those 10 are directly about fundraising or asking people for money, but they do help you develop answers and actions that direct the future of the organization and really, again, set you up for a successful campaign. A tip, if you're interested, is you can take this 10 campaign best practices, turn it into a checklist when you go back to the shop. You can do this with your development team. You can add a measure for quality, however you want to measure quality of each of those 10. You can also add a completion percentage, and voila, you have a scorecard in terms of where your organization might be along that trajectory of developing campaign readiness. So a campaign really, in its most simple terms, is an organizing principle, and it organizes complexity. It's important to keep in mind that all that complexity is there long before you launch a campaign. And so, again, we help our clients and our potential clients begin planning for campaign success as early as possible and from as full a view as possible. So we have, in fact, taken those 10, since each of them deserves their own webinar. But for today, we rolled them up into 3 buckets that are pretty foundational to campaign success. People, we're going to talk about people. We're going to talk about vision. We're going to talk about infrastructure. And some of the questions that the leaders of the organization can begin to ask themselves, questions that will drive answers around the people resource. Do our people have the right skills? Do they have enough devotion? Do they have the capacity to grow and stretch, as Dan will be talking about? And do they have the support to do so? Do we simply have enough of them? Are we ready to address both the technical challenges of a major fundraising campaign or any organizational expansion, and are we ready to lead change? Campaigns are really change initiatives. So questions that would drive vision: what do we need to do to serve our mission in the long term? What promises do we need to make and to keep to our stakeholders? What do we need to dream and to do to make a significant difference? And last but not least, questions about infrastructure. How is our engine running now, today, honestly? Is it reasonable to expect more out of what we already have? Do we need to invest upfront in staff and systems to drive success from the inside? Having solid plans, a compelling story, and the people to bring those things to life really make nonprofits highly attractive to major investor donors, and they really are critical to campaign success.
So let's start with my favorite component, which is people. Joanne asked a great question. Well, that first question, what makes campaigns a success? Essentially, campaigns are successful because of people and their relationships, and they are essentially the engine of the campaign. Staff are critical, since in nearly all instances, campaigns are grafted on top of operational fundraising. So staff are already engaged in their day job, their regular day job, And then they're presented with a long-term, multi-year effort to actually be on top of that as well. So that's a lot to ask for the staff. In my work in retained executive search, my focus has been to find, assess, and recruit the heads of development who bring strong campaign abilities. And normally when I go and do a search, we have these initial meetings, and it hits with these core players that you're seeing before you right now. We meet with the senior leadership, we meet with the board, we meet with the staff, also with donors and volunteers. And then among all these 5, at that time, everyone shares with us, confidentially, that they have a lot of anxiety about the campaign or the future of the campaign or the success of the campaigns. Board members say they don't feel ready. Some, and you can observe it and you hear from staff, is that some are more operational boards rather than governance-oriented boards. And sometimes in conversations, the board members don't even realize that they will become the primary drivers of the campaign and using their networks. Staff skill sets are not there. So if you're envisioning a campaign and you don't feel ready, that's actually the norm. So, you know, in thinking about development leadership, I can give you the long laundry list of qualifications that clients give to us, but really the core abilities boil down to 2. The first is to build and maintain trusting relationships among board, staff, senior leadership, donors and volunteers, and really moving them from that sense of anxiety and doubt to a shared sense that, yes, we can do this campaign. And then the second is to just keep moving the needle. As Joanne said, it's all about money. It really is. So you have to have clear, achievable goals that can be set for all the players within the campaign. And I like to think about it, because I like music, about it's being, you are the symphony conductor as the director of development. You're trying to keep all these 5 groups together in tempo and in rhythm. Campaigns require a lot of people management. So it's all about building capacity and systems and processes to manage, train, retain, and measure the effectiveness of all these people. You know, they all need at some point to flex their muscles and become stronger in all aspects. So staff in themselves will need to grow. And ideally, if you're thinking about a campaign, a director of development, an executive director and a board might need support with a campaign coordinator. So there could be additional hires. And then thinking about how we are going to build this pipeline of major gifts. And then think about potential staff also that we will need to help create the prospect research and the capacity to increase those donor prospects. And so those are the main elements that you'll likely see about staff and increasing resources.
I like what you're saying there, Dan. We've seen it many, many times. It seems obvious that people are critical to campaign success, but again, in terms of staffing requirements, it's not always the first idea that a nonprofit has. Investing in additional staffing. I'm also struck by that saying, because it really is people about people, that if you want to go faster, you need to slow down. Right. People can only change, stretch, and grow at the pace that they can do that at.
And I would just add to what you just said, Joanne, is that you also got to think about these people are going to be here for a long time. So you're not only recruiting new staff, you're retaining the staff over that long term too. So you have to think about the resources you need for all those multi-years as well.
That's right.
Thank you. So over the past few weeks, we've been interviewing organizations that Campbell & Company has partnered with on campaigns about these best practices. We'll be sharing the full interviews in a series of podcasts very soon. But for this webinar, we'd like to play just a couple of clips that are really relevant to these 3 buckets we've been talking about. So the first one is from the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, and they raised over $10 million for an outdoor science education camp that opened last June. And we asked the COO, how critical was leadership from your board? And here's what she said.
prior to this campaign, OMSI's board had really been focused more on operations and helping the museum to run its annual operations in a sustainable way. And this campaign represented a real shift toward a fundraising board. And to lead that shift really required board members being 100% bought in and then leading their peers. So I was very fortunate at the time to have an absolutely wonderful development committee chair, Walt Weiler, and he was the ultimate champion for this campaign. And I think really for helping the board to understand not only their role and how exciting being a volunteer fundraiser can really be when they're doing it for something that matters and that will make an impact, but also really helping people to understand their own capacity and their own willingness to stretch. And that wasn't something that we had had before.
Great, thanks, Dan. So once you've got your people in place, you can really start to coalesce around a vision for the campaign. And for a lot of people, this is the fun part. I know for me, it's the fun part. It's where all the passion and the energy is, but it's also really hard. So as Joanne mentioned, if you're thinking about a campaign, you've probably already done some work to identify some organizational needs, maybe through a strategic plan, or you've done some capital planning, you're thinking about a new building. And that's great. That's all going to come in really handy. But the work here is really to convert that organizational need into a vision for the community, something that's going to matter, that's going to, shape your city or your school or the environment, the planet for the next 10, 20 years. And that vision has to do a couple of things. One, it's got to be something that is ambitious but credible. So it could be a big idealistic and lofty idea. It could be very pragmatic, like doubling the number of people you serve. But it has to be a big idea that's distinct and that really kind of gets people's attention. And it's going to need to be backed up by a plan, and we'll get to that soon. That vision also has to add up to a list. It has to add up to something bigger than a list of projects. So maybe you started with a list of projects and you're kind of feeling ready to go with those few things, but it actually takes this process of sitting down and saying, okay, what does this mean? What is our vision around this? And you may be thinking, well, we've got a bunch of different priorities. We have a lot of different audiences. We're going to have a lot of different messages. How can we roll that all up into one big vision? And it is a challenge, but it is possible. Just like Joanne said, a campaign is an organizing principle. The vision is your organizing principle for your case. So even though you may have all different kinds of conversations with different kinds of people who may be interested in different things about your campaign, it's got to roll up to one big idea that is something greater. And then it's got to be distinct enough from your day-to-day work. And that's really important because the folks you're asking to be part of this campaign are likely already giving to your organizations, and they're giving major gifts. So you're going to be asking them to give over and above what they're already doing, and they need a good reason for that. So both in the content of your campaign vision and also how you present the campaign from beginning to end, it's gonna have to look and feel and sound distinct. And then finally, this question that I always have clients return to in this process is, what will be different? And the reason why I want to put this question front and center is because at the beginning of a campaign, you're doing all this investment, you're doing all this planning, and you can get really bogged down in the weeds of everything that has to happen. And so having this question just as your North Star for your vision is super essential, because it's gonna help your donors start to envision what world you're actually creating in 10 or 20 years. And so it can start to convert that big, scary dollar goal into something that feels like actually a really smart investment. And Dan mentioned, the fear that comes up with boards and staff, and the same can be true of a vision. It can feel scary and hard, especially when it's a sticky, sort of intangible thing that you have to do in the beginning of a campaign. But it really is essential, and we know that because we hear it from donors all the time in our campaign planning studies. When we go out and test these preliminary visions as part of our campaign planning studies, one of the biggest pieces of feedback that we hear is, this just looks like a list of projects, and where's the vision? I really want to see the vision. So people know if it's not there, they want to see something big. You're asking them for a big investment of time and resources, and they want to see something transformational for that. So don't skip over this process. Depending on where you are, it may take just a month, it may take a couple of months, and even if it's messy, it will be worth it down the road, just to keep people feeling inspired and having that North Star to keep guiding you throughout the campaign.
I just want to jump in, Anna. You know, as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, a couple things. Your vision has to be a far, far greater value than the dollar amount with the campaign, right? And I think that the vision is the single most important thing to have the campaign not be about money. So the vision becomes the thing that really galvanizes motivation, and then the campaign can just be the path to get to achieving that vision and making it a reality. Yep. And that's a great place to be.
And I would just add to that is that just having conversations with leaders who have been transformative and done, you know, campaigns that are at the 100 billion and greater, even if you're doing a $20 million campaign, the same story. It was the big hairy idea that got everybody excited and got major donors excited. So it's still the same, no matter the size of the campaign.
Yep, and it's not enough to just have a vision. You've got to really have something that people can use. You need to have a whole case for support. And there's a couple things that I like to talk with clients about when we're sort of converting that vision into a case. The first is really just nailing the whole story. You know, building around your vision a sense of time and place, a sense of urgency, and also a rationale for donors being part of the effort. You're really inviting them to be part of it, and that has to really come through loud and clear. Next, you want to make sure that there's that credible plan that I talked about, and we'll talk about that in the infrastructure section. But really, once you've inspired somebody with a vision, they're going to start to ask those questions about, you know, how is this going to happen? What's your budget? What's the ROI? What are the outcomes? And being prepared with those answers is going to be really, really important to pair with your case. And then you've got to have something that can be really workable in people's own words. And this is actually the most important piece. If there's anything I can impress upon you about the vision, is that it needs to live in conversations, because a campaign is not successful because of a really nice brochure that you made or a really beautiful website that a lot of people visit. Those are really just tools to support the conversations and the relationships that are going to really make this happen. So there's a lot of things that we do with our clients all the time to make sure that our process is built around conversations. We'll work on a case statement actually last in the process, and we'll really try to build in things like leadership briefings, focus groups, every opportunity possible to actually get out there and talk to people. Start with your safest group, you know, your internal leaders and your board, and then move out to some of your top donors. See what they say. Is the message resonating with them? Can your top ambassadors, those important people, can they make it personal and use their own stories and bring it to life? Those are the most important pieces of the process. And once you've nailed that, then you can start to get it out onto all the right channels. And those are going to support all of those conversations from beginning to end. So video, print, you know, building in talking points so that you can bring in stories about the campaign to those events that your organization is already having, and special campaign events. If you do all of those things, then you can really start to make the vision work in conversations and have those materials support you.
You're really describing kind of a comprehensive communication strategy, using these tools that capture your vision. And again, we're driving towards visionary giving, and those really large asks really deserve this much work in advance.
And what I like is that you're telling the right story, getting the clear plan in place, talking with the messaging getting in place, and having all the channels. And what it's breaking down to, and we often hear about this, is that you're really essentially getting everybody excited about the campaign in all aspects. So when in fundraising, we always talk about the culture of philanthropy. Campaigns are about creating and strengthening this culture of philanthropy in the organization that translate that the campaign is inclusive and becomes the responsibility of every single person who's involved in that campaign. Staff, board, volunteers, donors, ideally, every single person becomes an ambassador to the campaign, and it can really convey with passion the vision, case, and stories just so well. And in my opinion, the vision and the story is that music that really keeps everyone motivated and on point.
So here's another clip from our forthcoming podcast interviews. Methow Conservancy raised $20 million to complete 33 new conservation projects in the Methow Valley, and we asked Executive Director Jason Paulson this question about the campaign vision. How do you involve and appeal to people with different perspectives in a campaign vision that brings a whole community together? And how did that come together, and what lessons can we learn from that?
we started this process by engaging our community, asking them about their vision for the future of our valley. What did they hope for their children, for their grandchildren? What did they see as the obstacles or the threats to that vision coming to be? And then perhaps most specifically, what role did they think we as an organization could or should play in achieving that vision? And you learn an awful lot about how your community and your base of donors thinks about you when you engage them in those questions and then honestly listen to the feedback that they send back your direction. But when it came time to unveil our case statement and go visible in our community with that vision, it was very familiar to our community, because whether they recognized it or not, they had crafted it.
That's great.
Yeah, I love that. Go visible. Lots of work before you go visible. So I'm going to talk briefly about infrastructure, and I often think of infrastructure as the unloved stepchild at the great banquet table of the campaign, but it's absolutely fundamental. And I also like car metaphors. So, you know, this is about building the size chassis that you need so it can hold the size engine you need to drive forward and really win this campaign race. And again, nonprofits, we're so vulnerable to thinking we can show up in our 1997 Toyota Corolla for the Formula One race, and thinking that we can just do it on love and guts. It really doesn't work that way. There's a lot that goes into all of these planning components to really drive the entire organization forward. The business plan, development plan, both long-term and annual, the strategic plan that the board needs to be very engaged in and embracing of, setting feasible, reasonable, and achievable campaign goals, and all the mini goals that will add up to that big audacious goal for the campaign operating plan, how are we going to operate this nice job that we've just been given, and the communication plan that Anna was talking about. And the one that, these are pretty standard. We've all seen these over the last 40 years, right? None of this is a surprise. The one that's emerging more recently and is added to this list, it's more organizations are able to access a data-driven donor engagement. At least more organizations are pursuing data analysis of, doing wealth screenings. At Campbell & Company, our strategic information services also does take the wealth screening and do a capacity analysis, do a portfolio analysis, portfolio rebalancing. So there's many, many ways that we're beginning to use data to think about and to develop and to refine our data-driven donor engagement strategy. I want to use an example because since so many organizations are now able to access a wealth screening, and we've seen this many times. So an organization will have a wealth screening on everyone in there, all the contacts in their database, but no plan in place for what to make of it, how to think about that information strategically, and then use it strategically to design those donor engagement strategies. All of that, by the way, can be in place in advance of a campaign. I would encourage you to start thinking about that. Sometimes the infrastructure challenge is as simple as we have all this data, where are we going to put it? Where will it live? Who's going to manage it for us? Or are there 6 managers? Lots of fingers in the database, right? Easy to do a simple check, a user satisfaction survey with your own development team. Do people trust the data that's in there? Do they believe that it's accurate? Do they believe that it's current? Are they able to use it to generate a key performance indicator reports? All of that back to the house. So Anna is talking about present that big audacious front to the world when you go out, when you go public with your campaign, but make sure that you have as big a back so you can support that big front. So it all tracks back to people. People need to be able to have access to the tools that they need to stretch and grow and really drive forward. They need to know how to use those tools, and there needs to be time and attention put into figuring out the strategy for approaching it. You could give me a great set of tools to build a house, and I promise you would not get a house out of me anywhere near soon. There would need to be a long planning process for me about how am I going to use those tools, and does anybody have a basic design? So, you know, campaigns are engineered, they're organizing principles, but start well in advance. If you do this, you will create an organization that can, in fact, bear the weight of a major fundraising campaign and bear it successfully. So it's very worth it. Start early, and again, that 360-degree view. Look all the way around your organization, inside and out.
And just as an example of how this works in communications, where timing is everything, right? You might be managing your annual messaging and your campaign messaging at a certain time. You're going to be using different materials and different tools in each phase of the campaign. You're updating people as they give and as they want to, know what's going on in each phase. And the communications plan drives all of that. So you can't just have a good vision. It really needs to have that structure and strategic direction around it.
It just reminded me in large, complex organizations, and we work with many, just asking the development team, well, how many pieces of direct mail are your constituents getting over the course of a month? And if you're a healthcare organization, you're getting bills, you're getting reminders for your preventative, your wellness checks, you're getting thank yous from development, you're getting a lot of pieces of information. It's very hard to go to one place and pull up that number. Well, here's a group of folks who are getting all of these mailers this month. But that turns out to be critical, because otherwise you don't know what kind of experience your donors are really having of your organization. That's just one example.
Great, so we have one last podcast clip to share, and this is the DD of Seattle Academy talking to our Executive Vice President, Kate Roosevelt, who served as lead counsel on their recent campaign. And Erin, this clip is a little bit longer, but Erin just had some really juicy things to say about infrastructure, and this specific question on how did you step back to analyze where you were and refresh the campaign strategy. And if I could get the clip to play, it'd be really awesome. Bear with us here. There we go.
It's coming.
We really did step back and look, I would say every year, like you said, it was basically a 5-year journey. And, I'm thinking back right now in my mind to our summer board retreats and the fact that I made a presentation, or you did, I did, we did it together, basically every year. And that was always a really great time to look back on what we had done and to really take stock of where we were and think forward to the next fall and the next year of work and really look at, what volunteers do we need for next year? What tasks do we need them to do? Who are our prospects? In the latest phase of our campaign, we really had asked pretty much everyone, it feels like, in our community. And so a lot of our prospects that were remaining were going to be brand new families to the school, people very new to us. And so our techniques and tactics needed to shift a little bit for this final phase compared to the first phase when we were asking families, that had been in our school many, many years. And so, I think that we did take stock, and we really, we had an overall vision for the campaign that came out of the feasibility study, but we made annual plans each year that really reflected the nuances of where we were and what we wanted to accomplish in the next year, what fight we were going to take next, and how could we do that. I remember you were there for this. We had something that we called the Fall 40 one fall, and it was actually about making 40 asks. It wasn't even about gifts, because the making of the asks was something the volunteers could fully control, and so we wanted to really motivate them to do what they could do. And so we were going to make 40 asks this fall out of our prospect list. And every meeting we had a board, we checked them off, we tried to create visuals to show and motivate the progress that we had made every time we met. And you know, were 40 asks going to get us to 35 million? Well, not all the way, but it was going to take that next bite out of what we needed to do, and we did.
I love listening to Erin. You know, one of the non-financial benefits of a campaign is that success just feels really great. I mean, you can hear, and all three of the folks that we've shared with you today, their remarks. You can hear the enthusiasm and the pride and the delight that they feel at having achieved something so aspirational. The other thing that Erin talks about, which is this is a discipline. You can introduce this when you go back to work today, and that's that plan, do, check, adjust. Make your plan, do your plan, check your plan, and then adjust as necessary. That discipline cycle, start using it right away, because every campaign will need that going forward, again, over many years.
Yeah, what I really liked is how Erin said that in the process of this campaign, they had the first phase was fine, but the second phase they realized they had to go to new donors, new prospects,
right.
New people. And even in our second clip that we listened to, the community engagement, listening to the community and bringing in the community and getting their thoughts about and getting them excited about a campaign was important. So what I really enjoyed, what I was hearing from all three, was that the people that you start with the campaign are not necessarily going to be the people that end the campaign. It's going to be a much more larger group of constituencies, and that's exciting, I think.
I think it's super exciting, and there are, you know, some of the people who get on the bus in the beginning, hopefully, to your point, Dan, will be there when that bus crosses the finish line. But the bus makes a number of stops, and other people get on, and some people get off, and you know what? That's just fine over the course of a campaign. Which brings us to number 10 on our list of 10 best practices to fuel your campaign. And it's simple, but it is not easy, and that's stay the course. You know, this is a test of will and stamina, as well as enthusiasm and inspiration. And for a lot of campaigns, it really is about just keep doing it, and you will get there. And we have a visual to share with you, courtesy of Bryn Blanchard, who's a VP of Development at Seattle Humane Society. We showed this to her the other day, and she said, "Oh, wow!" And I'm sure you're thinking that right now. We don't intend for you to read the detail on this, but it's all right with Bryn that we share this. And this is again, this is the planning trajectory for Seattle Humane Society. They last year completed a $28 million campaign and opened a beautiful new facility. We got a first call from them to help them back in 2000. They asked us to come in and do a feasibility study and test the $6 million goal. They were quite clear that they needed a new facility. So to Anna's point, that the needs of the organization were very, very clear to them. But they had not traditionally been a fundraising board at all, and in fact didn't have a strong annual program. It's just not what they had been doing. They had not really needed to do it. And suddenly they were faced with, well, you know, really the only way to get this new building is to turn to donors. Totally legitimate. What I do want to point out, and this is not an unusual story in any way. So in 2000, we did their study. We came back and said, no, you can't launch a $6 million campaign. Internally, you're not ready, and externally, you're not ready. Your donors aren't ready to respond. They care, but they're just not ready. And while they can see your list of your needs, they don't know what it adds up to. That's the vision piece was really missing. And so over the course of a number of years, between 2000 and up until like 11 years later, 2012, we touched base with them over that period of time. They did a major kind of rebuilding their board. They did a whole strategic plan. They engaged other critical mission partners. That just took them a long time, but they stayed the course. They kept at it, and very proud to say they continue to refer to the feasibility study report that we gave them. It was that blueprint for how to get ready served them really well, and they did refer back to that. They gave us a call then 11 years later, and the board had just embraced and signed off on a full strategic plan and an important community collaboration, and they were ready to launch a campaign for their new facility, which was now going to have to be and could be a $28 million campaign rather than a $6 million campaign that they couldn't do in 2000. And by the way, 6 million to 2000 was aspirational. Everything has moved forward, right? Everything starts to cost more. And it was a transformative campaign. It was exciting. It's still exciting. That community and their stakeholders and their partners, they're just so proud and so fired up. I love to go there. I love to talk to everyone involved. I still run into folks in the community who were part of the campaign and just still really on fire with it. The campaign's completed. It was truly a transformational experience. And I think, I can't remember if I shared this, but I was really struck by one campaign volunteer saying that they were well into the campaign, and then she realized that she was the major brochure.
Right.
And that her ability to talk to and influence, engage donors and just bring them into the family, bring them into the fold, really took off when she realized she was the instrument. So start ASAP, your planning process. You're getting ready for that aspirational vision that you will use a campaign to achieve, and take a deep breath and stay the course. And with that, I think we might be ready for questions from you all.
Yes, I'm very delighted that we got through this quickly enough to really allow a lot of time for questions, and we've gotten some great ones over the course of the presentation. So first one, what happens when you join an organization that is in a very ambitious campaign, but is 0 for 3 regarding vision, people, infrastructure? I love this question. Have at it.
So the campaign's underway, but there's nothing supporting it, essentially. Well, who wants to tackle that one?
I guess that kind of depends how far along in the campaign it is.
And also your role. You joined as a board member, you were recruited as staff. I think that kind of goes to the what's your span of influence question, like who can you talk to and who can you influence, and how can you begin to help turn the ship?
I will say that it's very okay, and it's common, we see it with clients, to revisit the vision and have that process sometimes start and stop in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I often find that once that is really in place and the people are really on board and really armed with that vision, the thing just really starts moving. And so if that is your roadblock, if it is, I think spending some time really on that, it can really bring in the people, and it will kind of necessitate the infrastructure once that's pulled together. So it's okay to sort of, take a deep breath and revisit and say, okay, do we have a vision? If we don't, can we take some time to really sit down and talk through what this looks like? Can we get the right people on board? And not only does that start to move things, but it starts to get people inspired and engaged, and sometimes that helps start moving things as well.
I think that's
one of the things.
I think that's an opportunity to do, because this is a very complex question, and I think that we probably need to know a little bit way much more information about some of the challenges involved in this organization, this campaign. But essentially, I think there needs to be a time where there's going to be a talk between all the players to come together and to be really to be honest about what do we not have, what are our weaknesses, what are our gaps, what do we need to change, and getting the constituent groups, which would be the staff, the board, the campaign committee, some key donors, to be involved in that, and finding a facilitator who can ensure that there's going to be an honest dialogue. I think that might help create, bring out what the problems might be. And whoever sent that question, I think they already know what the problems are.
That would be my guess. I mean, you can use that 10 best checklist as a place to start. But again, it's not unusual for organizations to have to, well, let's pause and let's do an audit of our campaign. And I think that's a great place actually for a consulting firm to step in and help structure that audit. An alternative is do a self-conducted audit, and that will involve talking to stakeholders, which is essentially what both Dan and Anna are saying. You can do that. Sometimes we call it the 100 conversations. 100 is a bit of a metaphor, but you need to go out and have a substantive number of conversations with key stakeholders and just find out how they're feeling, what they think about what you've proposed to do.
And here's a really great related question. How do you convince your clients to invest in infrastructure?
That is a great question. And, convince, that's a tricky word, isn't it? So I think that I often go back to what's the business case for adding staff or spending upfront on infrastructure. And there are some ways to monetize the impact of staff. I'm going to pick a really easy example, and that's a major gift officer. And let's say your organization doesn't have one, or you have them, and you think that you need more. I think it is kind of a fairly straightforward equation. A full-time major gift officer can maybe manage 130 prospects annually in his or her portfolio. You can actually monetize the potential value of that pool of donors, particularly if you have a campaign structure and you know how many major gifts you need from a campaign, as well as keeping probably people in that portfolio steady with their annual gift, right? So there are potential dollars associated with all of these folks that you're holding as major gift opportunities. And reasonably, to do the job well, you can't overload those portfolios. So easy enough to create how many folks do you actually think qualify as major gift prospects? If you have 300 and you have one person who can really only hold and nurture and engage with 150, you need one more major gift officer to unlock and realize the potential dollars in that unmanaged portfolio. So that's an example of make the business case, always make the business case. And we often get asked, so what does it cost to run a campaign? What's the campaign cost? And so we have a pretty comprehensive budget that includes, of course, more than our consultant fee, but it could be anywhere between 6% if you have a really muscular shop already and a huge campaign, or it could be 15% if you're really kind of brand new to this major fundraising effort. So,
yeah, I agree with you, Joanne. And I think that you have to realize that this is a board level discussion, most importantly. When you're looking at bringing in more resources, the executive director, the development director, the finance director, the program director, they all need to come together and work on building that business case that they can present to the board, but also you've got to make sure that you have that data, because the term convince means that you've got to be able to go to the volunteer leadership and convince them. And most volunteer leaders I know, most of them want to see the data that will show that when they make an investment, because that's what it is, and most boards are made up of corporate leaders or for-profit leaders in some cases, they understand what investment means and what can be the potential windfall down the road. So you have to make that business case, you have to be ready for it, and you present it at the board.
I think this is where vision comes in too, because if you can really do a good job of articulating what's happening on the other side of this, the value of being successful in a campaign, not just for the community, but for the organization, how it's going to grow maybe your major gifts program, how you're going to bring in new donors. You know, we just recently conducted a study of past clients that showed that campaigns did not actually negatively affect annual funds at all. In fact, in more cases, they actually grew. They accelerated. So being able to point to some of those and looking at the the benefits long-term of the campaign, really make those investments feel wise. And I think the second thing is just that having the vantage point that we have working with so many clients, unfortunately, there are a lot of stories of what happens if you don't, looking at turnover, the costs of, losing key people midway through a campaign, and some of those things I think are really good arguments for that investment.
Great, thank you so much. It's really interesting.
We can go on and
yes.
on, but there's probably a question.
A whole webinar on infrastructure is coming.
Yes.
Thanks, Dan. Did you want to say something?
No, I just thought that was just a great question. How do you get it started?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. Okay, next question. We are now into our second campaign where our CEO has launched asking based on his vision, but not having conversations in the community to assess interest. He has great relationships in the community, but we are leaving money on the table and not staffing up or recruiting additional board members. Here's the question. Just what are your recommendations?
I think again, it sort of depends how far down the road you might be. But I'd say first, it's not necessarily a bad thing if the vision really starts and lives with one person, especially if it's the leader of your organization. That can actually be a really great tool for engaging people. But it is really essential to be having those conversations and making sure that that vision that one person has is also shared by folks in the community. And if it's not, is there a way to kind of think about a vision that sort of meets those needs for both parties, or is it worth going back to the board and looking at do we need to reassess what this campaign and refine what this campaign is all about? Because ultimately, if those are the folks, there's kind of these two stakeholder groups. There's the people who are going to support your campaign, and then there's also the beneficiaries. Sometimes those are the same groups, and sometimes they're not. But making sure that both of those voices are at the table is going to be essential, and then that leader can be just a better champion for that vision, whether it's the same exact vision that they started with or something that's slightly different. They can't really be the best champion for it unless those stakeholders are involved in some way. And so depending on where you are in the process, there's a whole bunch of ways you could do that. Something as formal as a campaign planning study where you're actually going out and having these interviews and surveys, or just having really informal one-on-one conversations and saying, hey, here's the vision we've been working with. What do you think? How
does it resonate?
Yeah.
Here's a kind of another way to think of it, because that was presented as possible threats to campaign success. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing you can also do, a campaign goal is also kind of has a stabilizing effect, right? And if you back out certain benchmarks that you need to meet so that they accumulate to hit that final goal, that's also a way to keep tabs on is there enough momentum in the campaign. So I would say that it may not, in fact, be a threat to the campaign that you're leaving money on the table, because I promise you will have a third campaign. So it might be all right that not every gift right now is optimized. Mm-hmm. And the only way that you'll know if that's okay is if you are hitting those benchmarks and you're staying ahead of any potential of running out of pipeline of possible donors. Mm-hmm. So, before you panic about leaving money on the table, do that kind of projection. Can you hit your benchmarks? Do those benchmarks add up to the goals that you need to hit? If the answer is yes, then you have the opportunity to take really good care of those donors so that they'll be ready to give again or give more next time. So that's also a possible way to analyze whether or not it's the magnitude of that particular threat.
Right. It can end up being a smaller effort with a smaller pool of donors, and that may be perfectly fine. Or
a longer effort that includes more donors at lower leverage giving, which then results in a larger base. So it's not necessarily a loss.
Great. Next question: how can any of these suggestions be adapted for a small organization such as a museum with a $30,000 budget, all volunteer, and we're looking for a $100,000 project to restore a lighthouse?
That sounds so interesting. Well, this could just be my bias, but I actually think all 10 of those best practices can be employed. You know, the challenge with, as Dan, as you said, even with a group of trained, ambitious professionals doing their day job, adding a campaign to it can feel like a real strain. It's the same with volunteers. They don't. It's harder to boss them around, you know, if they don't work for you. But again, I think it's that same process of pulling people together and really getting them engaged about what's possible. And you can do a whole training with your volunteers on these 10 best practices. What do they mean? How are we doing on all of these?
I think it comes down to people. You know, when you're limited in your resources and there's a lot of things to invest in up front, I think first taking stock of who you have, you know, what kind of time they have, what kind of skills they have. I think a lot of these things can be carried out by people, and just, you know, it's looking at what they're already responsible for, and can we move things around to have them, you know, spend a little bit of time carving out the case for this particular project, and you know, bringing donors on board for this particular project. A lot can be done within your own organization, just looking at, you know, your leaders, and maybe it means getting a couple other people on board who can help with that, and then make it not such a strain on the organization. But yeah,
you know, small successes really encourage confidence and lead to and accumulate to larger successes. So again, start small and set it up so that people can succeed at these incremental, like Aaron was saying, what's the next bite? Just figure out what's the next bite and who can take it and what's the result, and take some time, you know, and craft a vision. How is the world going to be changed if you get that new lighthouse? I'm going crazy in my mind with the metaphor.
So many possibilities.
So many possibilities.
Great, thank you. Here's more of a comment, but I'm sure you'll have something to say. So insightful. So this person says, thank you for reinforcing the truth that campaigns are about people. Money is the byproduct of vision and relationships. Organizations that can hold this paradox and operationalize it ultimately raise more money. A donor once told me, money is a form of energy to make good things happen. I've never forgotten this.
Great.
True. It's true.
Great. I'd like to go back to a question that was asked earlier in the presentation, and this was, I think, primarily for Dan, and wondering about the effect of a campaign on the business office and how kind of that factors into the whole people part of things.
Yeah, important. I mean, with the business office and with the development offices, there's always this kind of pull and tug between both of those offices, and I think that's what's important is that, you know, both the leadership of those two offices really have good communication with each other. I mean, that's very solid, and to be working with each other. And I know, you know, finance is a very different world, you know, or the business office is a different world. They need to there's treasury function, the accounting function, the finance functions. They're all trying to keep everything contained and in compliance, and they've got all these sets of worries. Whereas development is thinking about how to, you know, bring more resources into the organization through a campaign. The idea is that revenues are important to even to the business office and investments, and they will understand it. So you've got to be able to continue having a strong dialogue. And in many cases where development leaders have issues is usually sometimes with the business office, the finance office, you know, and being told no, because, you know, finance, you know, as you know, anybody in the business office love to say that no, but being able to think beyond that. And then going to the executive director, having that conversation with the executive director, and then maybe also bringing in a board member as well, if needed. Somebody might be from the finance committee, the development committee, to kind of help talk about the campaign and iron out any of the difficulties. That might be some avenues.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our scheduled time. That went really fast.
Wow, that flew by.
So on behalf of Campbell & Company, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. If we didn't get to your specific question, please feel free to shoot us an email. We hope you'll also take a moment to fill out a very short survey about your experience today that'll pop up on your screen when you check out so that we can improve our webinars in the future. We also hope you'll join us for our next webinar in our free webinar series. And we thank you so much again and have a great day.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.